Hi. I'm just wondering, the US has a Bill of Rights, and I'm just wondering why the president, for instance, can get away with abuses of human rights, internal abuses of human rights. The US, of course, is in its external genocidal wars of aggression has murdered, maimed, tortured and displaced millions of people. But internally we see black people being executed almost daily. Obama, for instance, prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other presidents combined. Under the National Defence Authorisation Act, he claimed the right to incarcerate his own citizens on the basis of secret evidence. He also claimed the right to murder his own, and exercised his right to murder his own citizens on the basis of secret evidence. America has less than 5% of the world's population and more than 25% of the world's prison population. At any given time, 80,000 people are being held in solitary confinement. So if the president can flout the Bill of Rights so wantonly, what is, under an autocratic government in Australia, what would be the point of having a Bill of Rights?
I mean, I think I'll let Em talk about the Bill of Rights aspect, but I mean, more broadly on the US, yes, absolutely, the US is responsible for a bunch of human rights abuses, and I think with all of the attention that's now focused on Trump, people sometimes forget that actually, a lot of these things, such as the increased killings by drones and these changes that have resulted in more civilian casualties that have made it easier for airstrikes by the US to drop bombs on areas where there's lots of civilians in Mosul. All of those changes that made it easier to sort of loosen, I guess, the rules of engagement, that actually happened under Obama. It didn't happen under Trump. So, I think we're certainly about holding all governments to account equally, and I think where human rights abuses do occur, we do want to ensure that those perpetrators are held to account. But we do know that Rome Statute, so as far as international...
And I think, you've made a really good point in terms of the fact that laws alone are not enough to prevent a lot of abuses. But what they can do is be one part of a many-faceted way of trying to protect human rights. So, you've pointed out some of the limitations of the Bill of Rights there, and I think when you're talking about something like drone strikes, you actually did have lawyers in the United States desperately trying to use the Bill of Rights to protect the rights of US citizens who are being killed overseas. And you certainly have rights cases being brought for a whole range of things. So we can certainly point to the way that the Bill of Rights doesn't work. But then you can also look at the way that it has produced some really good outcomes. And I think the travel ban stuff in the United States is a really good example of that. In terms of what it could do here, we have absolutely no way of holding our government at the federal level to account for things like the metadata retention laws, or holding our state governments to account for just chipping away at our protest rights, as I mentioned. And if we had some sort of law at the national level, we could actually take the government to court, and the court could potentially strike down the law saying it is inconsistent with human rights. And that's the kind of legal protection that I think we need. It's not. I would never say it's the only thing that we need, but I think it's a really important tool for us to have.
Thank you. I'll begin with a comment that I come from a third world country, and we realize that the poorer the country is, the less the press and media are free, because it actually becomes very expensive. If you try to get your opinion known in a third world country, you're going to have to pay the media, the corporate media in particular. So my first question is to Elaine. The human rights and the rule of law go together. And important to the rule of law is the court of law. Are we not perhaps fighting the battle for human rights on the wrong battlefield by resorting to the trial by popularity, by media, instead of resorting to the rule of law and the courts of law. Because many have gotten away with crimes because they've resorted to the courts of public opinion instead of the courts of law. The second is, to Emily, I commend your praise for our constitutional courts. Therefore, my question would be, how can we organize so that political and non-government groups can have a mass class action to defend those two rights that you've mentioned? Because we need to organize and present our courts to the proper courts of law, in my opinion, in order to defend them and in order to defend our rights. And the third question, I guess, is to the panel and to all of us. I'm sorry, it's a short question.
Okay.
And it could be a rhetorical one. Should we not also take into account the violation of human rights by the very crime of poverty that is striking many Australians, especially in my computations? For every homeless person out in the street, there are 8 vacant housing units held vacant because they are serving investment purposes rather than serving the human rights to have a decent dwelling. Thank you.
I'll take that first question, which was, I guess, about whether we should be fighting for rights in the courts as opposed to, in the media. And I think, absolutely, I think this is a battle on all sorts of different fronts. And the work of organisations like the Human Rights Law Centre, like the ACLU, that take on legal challenges through strategic litigation is really important. And I mean, the few wins that we've had with regards to asylum seekers and refugees have been won in the courts. So, I think that's very important, but I think, the two go together. And so Human Rights Watch is an organisation of lawyers, but we don't do strategic litigation. That's not our role. Our role is to expose what is happening, to generate public pressure, because we feel that politicians, they do respond when there's pressure coming at them from different angles. So for us, it's about finding the leverage in order to, to hold, I guess, governments to account. But ultimately, we hope that a lot of these human rights violations get solved by the perpetrators, being held to account in courts. It's just not our role to actually take those cases on ourselves.
And I'll take the second question, which was about how we can rally towards better protection for, I think, free speech and freedom of protest in the courts. So, I mean, one of the things that we have in Australia, one of the limited protections we have is freedom of political communication. And that was something that our High Court implied into the Constitution. And that is the basis on which Bob Brown brought his case challenging the Tasmanian anti-protest laws. So the Human Rights Law Centre intervened and as part of that we tried to expand the way that the court understands that freedom, because at the moment it's very, very difficult for third parties like us to get before a court on a human rights case. So it's very difficult to sort of mobilise at the court when you don't have a cause of action, a right to defend necessarily, and you don't have a right to be there. And Australian courts are generally quite conservative, and that's why I think if we're going to rally around things, we should rally around getting that protection in law and getting us a right to be in court in the first place.
All right, thank you for your talk. Okay, against the backdrop of systemic abuse of asylum seekers, institutional child abuse, Aboriginal incarceration and entrenched disadvantage, marriage inequality, anti-terror legislation, detention without charge, invasion of privacy, metadata detention, homelessness, social and economic inequality, anti-protest laws, attacks on trade unions. What do you think of Tony Abbott's assertion that a Bill of Rights is a left-wing conspiracy designed to undermine our democracy, implement social engineering, and increase the power of the judiciary at the expense of Parliament.
It was kind of a rhetorical question, but one thing that I will respond to is, because that is just the classic response of conservative people to any discussion of a Bill of Rights, that somehow judges are going to have too much power. The reality is that what a Bill of Rights would do is reduce the power of the Parliament and of the executive government, and that is why politicians like Tony Abbott do not want a Bill of Rights.
I'd like to thank the wonderful speakers, especially Emily Howie, who dealt with the situation right here. And the reference to the Second World War has always been in my mind, as my father was a refugee from Austria in '38. But what drives me crazy, really, is the ABC and the role of the ABC. I'm not sure why people are laughing, but anyway. Yeah, there seems to be, if the two major parties agree that human rights abuse is okay, then Frank Kelly or whoever it is cannot ask them about it. So you can be doing virtually anything. Locking people up on prison islands is fine if both parties agree with it. So there's nothing in the ABC that's promoting human rights. It's not in the Charter, it's not anywhere. And there seems to be an understanding that you can't bring up the subject. And I keep on writing to Philip Adams, who I think he was referring to me when he referred to someone with a few kangaroos loose in the top field the other day. Or it may have been someone else who writes to him every week. I keep on asking him he's done all right on East Timor, and in the past he's done good things. But isn't there anyone going to bring up the subject of human rights? Whose job is it? Is it no one's job? Is it Four Corners' job? And if Four Corners done something, then you can mention it. But otherwise, it's like it's a disappearing chick. It doesn't exist. Okay, I've said enough about that. One more of a comment than anything else. I'd like to promote this or anything else that supports human rights. And it could be solidarity, it could be red flag, it could be whatever. But whatever you think promotes human rights, please support it. Support the publication. And if you think it's the Sydney Morning Herald, then I'd say on the 16th of June, on the editorial, it said, "We support offshore processing, but we think it should be good and nice conditions." So I'm not sure what they mean by that. Maybe gold plating the taps in the concentration camps. I'm not sure what they mean. I'm not sure what the Sydney Morning Herald actually means by making concentration camps nice. But I would say just let's support the organs of communication that support us. Thank you.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Four Corners because, when you were making those comments, I was thinking about how that program that aired last year within 12 hours led to a royal commission into abuses against children in detention. And I mean, those abuses that were aired in that episode, they were already very well known to those of us who work in this field. I'd read the Children's Commissioner's report. We'd called on Turnbull to act. Nothing had been done. And I think that does show the power of the media that, so quickly, all of a sudden, we had this response because you had the images of that happening and it was something that the government couldn't ignore. But absolutely, I think we need more investigative journalism. We need more of a focus also on what Australia is doing in other countries and what, issues are happening where Australia should be, more engaged and more involved in human rights.
Yeah, and I was also thinking of 730, which has done a lot of really great reporting in support of some of the work of the Human Rights Law Centre as well. We ran a case in Victoria trying to get young people out of maximum security adult prison, and 730 reporters actually took that story on and really did some great reporting on it as well. It's part of both mine and Elaine's job to try and interest the media in stories as well. And, it can be difficult because, when you've got vulnerable clients or vulnerable witnesses and the media wants a person, they want to speak to that person, they don't always want to be in the story. And that can kill a story as well, and it can kill a story when the government won't respond. But yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with Elaine. Like the more investigative reporting that we can get, the better. But this is a really tough media environment at the moment as well.
Yeah, thanks very much to the speakers. I wanted to raise an issue which is not normally mentioned as a human rights issue, and that is the right to organise, that is the right to organise in trade unions. And going back to what was said from the platform, the reason, or one of the essential reasons why Australia has a strong democratic tradition is that we have had a strong trade union movement. Yeah. And those two things are completely and totally intertwined. And to me, one of the reasons for the war, which comes first? One of the processes that's been taking place is a weakening of the trade union movement and a weakening of trade union rights, and that has gone hand in glove with the weakening of our democratic rights. I just want to mention one particular very, very extreme case which I think should go to the United Nations or somewhere, and that is the Australian Building and Construction Commission. This legislation, which the last election was fought around, is actually an extreme attack on democratic rights and human rights. Under this, you have a worker on a trade union site, in a building site, has no right of silence. The basic habeas corpus rules are removed. They have no right of silence. They are forced to speak out irrespective of anything. They are not, as I understand it, even allowed to have a lawyer present, and so on. So this thing is a secret police operation which is stronger than virtually most countries in the Western world. And I think that I would just perhaps ask the speakers if these issues have been taken up in the Human Rights Commission or in the human rights area, that we have some of the worst anti-union and anti-democratic, anti-worker laws in the Western world. And I think that's something we've really got to put up right up front of our struggle for democratic rights. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really great question. And, I guess in some ways our movements have come from different places, the trade union movement and the human rights movement. But I think more and more we're seeing the need to work together on things. And certainly when we've done some reporting to the UN before, we've reported on the Building and Construction Commission and the attacks on freedom of association and rights to work that are going on in Australia. We also, the Human Rights Law Centre put out a report about a year ago now that looked at a range of different attacks on democracy in Australia, and we launched that report with Jed Carney from the ACTU, along with Oxfam, philanthropy organisations, green groups, a whole range. And it was really important to us to have the trade union movement there as well. And it's something that I see a lot more interest, not just with the human rights movement, but actually with human rights movement, the green groups, the ACTU, faith-based groups, community organisations, actually seeing more and more that what we need to do is actually stand together because we're stronger together. And some of these attacks, like the gag clauses in funding agreement and trying to silence organisations, are happening to all of the organisations in different ways. So, yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's something we could all work on.
Hi there. I think this is the first question I've ever asked in the current session of Politics in the Pub, but thanks very much for the speakers. And my question... Oh, I don't deserve a clap for that. My question, really, a very loosely formulated one, is I'm very concerned about the cause of the Syrians in northern Syria. The Kurdish struggle in northern Syria, and the connection to Australian Kurds, and in particular to the case of the journalist, the Kurdish journalist, who's currently under charges. I think they're under the anti-terrorist legislation. I've forgotten his first name, I'm sorry. His surname is Lelikan. Are you familiar with this case? Because I wanted to ask. And so he's a journalist, and the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, is a proscribed organisation. So My question really relates to two things. What happens, how wide and loose are these legislation relating to proscribed organisations, and I'm particularly concerned with the PKK and with the case of this Kurdish journalist who's been charged. I don't know the details of the charges, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with them, but just perhaps if you're not familiar with those specific charges, just how loose and wide is this legislation relating to people who are alleged to support or be members of a proscribed organisation such as the PKK?
So regarding that legislation, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the specifics of the case that you're talking about. But the government does publish lists of organisations that it prescribes as terrorist organisations. I'm not sure whether the PKK is on that list or not. It is. But I certainly know our concerns, I guess, with the law, or maybe just to flesh it out a little bit more, is that, you know, they're saying, well, what's the problem? Anyone who's a member of an armed group, anyone who's a member of, you know, ISIS or the PKK is a legitimate target. And this is, you know, the position under the laws of war. International humanitarian law says that you can target combatants even if they're not actively in combat. But what we know from the situation in Mosul is that a lot of people who are with ISIS are there against their will. I mean, women have been sold into sexual slavery, they've been forced to marry ISIS fighters. There are a lot of people there in Mosul. The people who've been left behind are the elderly, children, families, people with disabilities. And some of those people are in menial roles providing services to ISIS. They might be making tea for ISIS fighters. Now, does that make them, because they're facilitating the work of ISIS by making, you know, tea for ISIS fighters, does that make them a legitimate target of assassination? We would say no, absolutely not. But that's my worry with this law, is that it's not clear. And so that's why I think, you know, there really needs to be more scrutiny and more accountability about, you know, exactly who is going to be targeted under that law.
Thank you to the speakers for your presentations. My question, well, you mentioned that Australia now has to step in, given that Trump isn't providing the global leadership, and it's up to middle power countries to step in and provide and fill in that leadership vacuum. Do you think Australian civil society and academia need to level up their game as well, so that Australia has more legitimacy in providing leadership as a middle power country?
Yes, I think absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, we work very closely with a lot of civil society organisations and academics, but I think there needs to be more scrutiny of Australia's place in the world. I think there's a lot of great organisations that are focused on what's happening right here in Australia, but actually there's not that many think tanks looking at Australia's foreign policy and what is the impact of it. I think it would be really great if civil society and academic institutions were more a part of that discussion, because ultimately this is also about, you know, people-to-people relationships. It's not just about, you know, governments forming relationships with other governments.
I mean, I'll respond to that in the sense that, look, there are 250,000 university students who live in Sydney, leaving aside the staff who are responsible for them. And that's their presence, despite what Emily said, is dominated by their absence on human rights issues. There's a massive illiteracy about human rights among the Australian public, but in particular about that 250,000 people and more, if you included TAFE, who have to carry the banner. I mean, in other words, there would be a massive ignorance even about the most important document of the 20th century, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was a very good question, that last one. Yeah.
My question I want to ask is that when you look internationally at all the human rights violations in different countries, I just want to know, why does countries like Iran and China receive far more criticism from human rights organizations than, say, countries like Saudi Arabia or India, even though when you look at in relative context, each country has their own human rights problems. And for follow on, what is the role played by imperialism, especially in terms of U.S. interests in pushing this type of views, so that some countries get far more criticism than others? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I mean, we certainly don't rank countries in terms of who is the world's worst human rights violators. We think every country has the same responsibility to uphold human rights standards, and all countries have human rights problems. No one's perfect. But absolutely, I think there's inconsistency applied in terms of the countries that repeatedly come up under more scrutiny at the UN and these forums than others. And Saudi Arabia is a case in point. I mean, I think it's disgusting that the US administration has just signed, more than $1 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, when Saudi Arabia is leading this coalition that is bombing civilians in Yemen with devastating results. And Australia also. I mean, Australia has made 4 defence exports. We're not even allowed to know what has been exported to Saudi Arabia. But we're told, oh, well, don't worry about it. We're sure that, just trust us, it won't be used in the conflict in Yemen. And that's not good enough. I mean, we need more transparency from defence about this. But we try very hard to make sure that we hold all countries to account. So, we have a world report that we put out every year. It has chapters on 90 countries where we work around the world. Saudi Arabia is there, the United States is there, Australia is there. But as I said, we don't say that, one situation is better than others, because, in all cases, the way to resolve those issues is really going to depend also about building a discussion amongst, the civil society and the people of that country to stand up against these abuses.
Sort of follow up on that is, I think that a lot of countries, there is obviously some inconsistency in the way that countries are treated, but we also need to be careful that countries don't hide behind that kind of relativist argument in order to try and avoid accountability for the abuses there. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Australia likes to do. Oh, we're not as bad as those others. That's absolutely not the point. The point is you have signed these treaties and international laws. You have voluntarily agreed to be bound to these standards, and all we are doing is holding you to the standards that you've agreed to be bound by. And so, the relativist argument really worries me for that kind of reason.
Okay, well, one of the human rights of an audience is to make sure that the chairperson doesn't allow the meeting to go on for too long. The next topic, the topic for next week is somehow related. It's about why we urgently need a federal a commission against corruption. The speakers are Michael Ahrens, the Director of Transparency International Australia, and the recently besieged Green Senator Lee Rhiannon. And the week after that, if we want to pursue the arguments that Elaine and Emily have articulated this evening, it's a night with Richard Ackland, who was previously the formidable law correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald. He's now a columnist for The Guardian. And to my mind, more impressively, he uses satire frequently to protect human rights under the name of Gadfly in the Saturday paper. So that's for 2 weeks' time. Next week, why we urgently need a federal level ICAC. I used to say to students, to undergraduate students, if you have come down to politics in the pub for an hour and a half, you may learn a lot more than if you attended lectures for 12 weeks. Now, and I'm risking insulting any academics who are present, but I feel that way about what Emily and Elaine have given us tonight. Thank you very much. That's a very good shortcut way of passing exams.